The dust rose in small clouds with each step. Son House watched from his porch as the figure approached down the dirt road. Afternoon sun turning everything the color of rust and regret. Even from a distance, Son could tell this wasn't a field hand coming home from work. The gait was wrong, too hesitant, too careful. And that shape on the back, wrapped in burlap and tied with twine, could only be one thing: a guitar. Son leaned back in his chair and took a pull from the bottle beside him. Another one, he thought. Another boy who thinks he can play because he heard a record once or saw a traveling musician at a juke joint. The Delta was full of them. Boys who wanted the glory without the suffering, the attention without the scars. They all had smooth hands and big dreams, and Son House had sent every single one of them away. Robert Johnson was 17 years old in the summer of 1930, skinny as a fence post, and just as useful, according to most folks who knew him. He had soft hands because he'd never picked cotton long enough to build the calluses that marked a real Delta man. Had a face that women looked at twice but men dismissed on first glance. There was something unfinished about him, like he was still deciding what kind of person he wanted to be. His stepfather called him lazy. His mother called him special. The musicians in Clarksdale called him nothing at all, because he wasn't good enough yet to earn a name. But Robert had heard Son House play exactly once, 3 months earlier at a Saturday night fish fry, and it had changed something fundamental in his chest. The way Son bent those strings. The way his voice sounded like it was being dragged up from some deep place that most people didn't have access to. Robert knew, with the certainty that only the young and foolish possess, that he needed to learn from Son House, or he would never be complete. Son House was 38 years old and looked 60. The blues did that to a man. Wore you down from the inside, used up your youth like fuel, left you hollow but somehow more real than people who'd never played a note. He'd killed a man once, in self-defense, spent time in Parchman Farm prison, and come out the other side with a guitar and a voice that could make grown men cry. He didn't teach. Didn't have patience for fumbling fingers and missed notes. The blues wasn't something you taught anyway. It was something that happened to you, like lightning or love or loss. Either you had it or you didn't. And this skinny kid walking up his road definitely didn't have it. Robert stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Up close, Son could see the guitar was even worse than he'd thought. Cheap piece of factory junk, probably ordered from a Sears catalog, with strings that looked like they'd been on there since Coolidge was president. The boy's hands gripped the neck too tight. Nervous. Son almost felt bad for what he was about to do. Almost. But the Delta didn't run on kindness. It ran on truth. And the truth was going to hit this boy hard. They didn't exchange pleasantries. In the Delta, music was the introduction. Robert unwrapped his guitar with the kind of reverence that told Son the instrument meant more to the boy than it deserved. Sat down on the bottom step without being invited. Started tuning by ear, which took longer than it should have because his ear wasn't trained yet. Son watched the fingers fumble across the frets, watched the boy's face scrunch up in concentration, and already knew how this was going to end. Finally, Robert looked up, met Son's eyes with that mixture of hope and fear that young musicians always carried, and without a word, started to play. It was bad. Not just amateur bad, fundamentally broken bad. Robert's fingers were in the wrong positions. His rhythm wandered like a drunk man looking for home. The notes he hit were technically correct but soulless, like reading words without understanding the language. Son let him play through one complete verse before raising his hand. Stop. Robert's fingers froze on the strings. The silence that followed felt heavier than the music had been. Son took another drink, wiped his mouth, looked at this boy who'd walked however many miles to get rejected by a man he'd never met. Son House spoke 6 words that would become legend. Words that would be repeated in juke joints and on front porches for the next 90 years. Words that would define both men in ways neither could predict. You don't know nothing, boy. Nothing. He let that sink in for a moment. Watched the hope drain out of Robert's face like water from a cracked cup, then delivered the rest. Go on home. Don't come back till you learn how to play. And maybe don't come back at all, because I don't think you got it in you. Robert Johnson stood up slowly, wrapped his guitar back in the burlap. Didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't ask for another chance. Just nodded once, turned around, and walked back down that dirt road the same way he'd come. Son watched him go, and felt nothing. Not guilt, not satisfaction, nothing. Just another boy learning that wanting something wasn't the same as earning it. Son finished his bottle and went inside to sleep. He forgot about Robert Johnson within an hour. It would be 6 months before he remembered. And when he did, he would wish he'd never met the boy at all. The stories about what happened in those 6 months vary depending on who's telling them. Some say Robert went down to the crossroads at midnight and met a tall man in black who tuned his guitar for him in exchange for his soul. Others claim he found an old blues player named Ike Zimmerman who taught him in graveyards at night where the dead could listen and the living wouldn't interrupt. A few insist he simply practiced 18 hours a day until his fingers bled and his mind broke, and something new grew in the space where his old self used to be. The truth, like most truths about Robert Johnson, lives somewhere between fact and folklore. What we know for certain is that he disappeared from Clarksdale in early summer of 1930, and when he came back in late November, he wasn't the same person who'd left. Son House was playing a juke joint outside Clarksdale on a Saturday night in November. The place was packed with bodies and smoke and bootleg whiskey. Son was 3 songs into his set, fingers moving across the fretboard with the kind of confidence that comes from doing something so many times, it becomes reflex rather than thought. He was singing about a woman who'd left him, which was every woman he'd ever known when he felt it. A change in the room. Not the temperature, not the crowd, something deeper. The air itself seemed to shift, like the moment before a storm when all the birds go quiet. Son's fingers kept playing, but his attention moved to the door. Robert Johnson stood in the doorway, or something wearing Robert Johnson's face stood there. Because the boy Son had sent away 6 months ago had been uncertain, unfinished, searching. This version was complete, filled in, like someone had taken a sketch and turned it into a finished painting. He was thinner, if that was possible. Clothes hung off him like they were 2 sizes too big, but his posture was different, straighter, more certain. And his hands, visible even from across the room, had calluses now, deep ones. The kind you got from playing until skin tore and healed and tore again. Son stopped mid-verse. The room noticed. When Son House stopped playing, something was wrong. Robert walked through the crowd like he owned the place. People parted without being asked. He carried a different guitar now, still cheap, still beat up, but it looked like it had been played recently, played hard, played constantly. He stopped in front of Son House's chair and waited. Didn't speak, didn't smile. Just waited with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. Son felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Unease, not fear exactly, but close enough to make his hands cold. Son House was not a man who shared his stage easily. The musicians he respected could be counted on one hand with fingers left over. But something about the way Robert stood there, guitar in hand, eyes steady and certain, made Son nod. Once. Permission granted. Robert sat down in the empty chair beside him, started tuning his guitar, and even the tuning was different now. Faster, more precise. Like his hands knew where every note lived and how to find it without looking. The crowd sensed something was about to happen. The talking stopped. The drinking slowed. Everyone turned to watch 2 men with guitars in the corner of a juke joint in the middle of nowhere, Mississippi. Robert played a single chord. Just one. But the sound that came out of that cheap guitar made 3 people in the front row take a step backward. It wasn't loud. It wasn't distorted. It was just impossibly right. The kind of right that shouldn't exist in a world where people had to learn and practice and fail before they got good. Son House had heard 1,000 guitarists play 1,000 chords. This was different. This was something else entirely. Robert's fingers moved to the next chord, then the next, building a progression that Son recognized from traditional Delta blues, but played with a sophistication that took most musicians decades to develop. Robert's thumb kept a bass line going that sounded like 2 people playing at once. His fingers picked out a melody on top that wove in and out of the rhythm like smoke, and then he started to sing. The voice was wrong. Not bad. Wrong. Robert had sung for Son 6 months ago, and it had been average, pleasant but unremarkable. This voice sounded like it had been aged in a barrel for 50 years. Rough and smooth at the same time. Young but ancient. Telling stories about crossroads and devil dogs and women with eyes like midnight. The lyrics were Robert's own, Son could tell, because nobody else would write about the specific dirt roads and pine trees and desperate choices that existed only in Robert's version of the Delta. But the delivery was borrowed from somewhere else, from someone else, or something else. Son House's hands started shaking. Not from drink, not from age, from recognition. Because he'd heard this before. Not these exact songs, but this exact sound. The sound of someone who'd gone somewhere normal people couldn't go and brought something back that normal people shouldn't hear. Son had made that trip himself once, in Parchman Farm, where suffering compressed time and turned men into either animals or artists. He'd thought he was the only one who'd been to that place. Looking at Robert now, seeing the emptiness behind the skill, the void behind the virtuosity. Son realized he was wrong. Robert had been somewhere worse. And whatever he'd traded to learn to play like this, Son wasn't sure the music was worth the price. Robert played for 20 minutes without stopping. Song flowed into song like water. His fingers never hesitated, never missed, never fumbled the way they had 6 months ago. The crowd stood frozen. Some people had tears on their faces and didn't know why. Others looked scared, like they were witnessing something they shouldn't. One woman near the back made the sign of the cross and left. The rest stayed, hypnotized by sound that felt both familiar and completely alien. When Robert finally stopped, letting the last note fade into silence, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The room hung suspended in that moment like a photograph. Sunhouse found his voice first. Asked the question everyone wanted to ask, but nobody had the courage to speak. Where did you learn to play like that? Robert looked at him, and Sun saw something in those eyes that made his stomach drop. Recognition without warmth, knowledge without wisdom. The look of someone who'd seen too much too fast and couldn't unsee it. Robert's answer was 5 words. 5 words that musicians in the Delta would repeat for generations. 5 words that turned Robert Johnson from a person into a legend. I went down to the crossroads. The way he said it wasn't metaphorical, wasn't poetic, was pure statement of fact. Like saying he went to the store or walked to town. Sunhouse had heard the crossroads stories his whole life. Every blues musician had. The place where highways 61 and 49 met. Where you could go at midnight and meet a man who would tune your guitar and teach you to play better than any human had a right to play. In exchange for your soul. Most people thought it was just a story. A way to explain natural talent or lucky breaks. Looking at Robert Johnson now, at the calluses that shouldn't exist after 6 months, at the skill that couldn't be taught in 6 years, at the emptiness in his eyes that spoke of deals made and prices paid, Sunhouse wasn't sure it was a story anymore. The rest of that night blurred. People wanted Robert to keep playing. He did. Song after song after song, each one perfect. Each one slightly wrong in ways that were hard to name. Like looking at your reflection and realizing it's smiling when you're not. Sunhouse played too, but his hands felt clumsy now. His timing felt off. Everything he'd spent 20 years learning felt like child's play compared to what Robert could do after 6 months. By 3 in the morning, most people had left. Sun and Robert sat alone in the empty juke joint, guitars on their laps, bottle between them. Sun asked questions. How? Where? Who? Robert answered some, stayed silent on others. The answers he gave were worse than the silence. Sunhouse made a decision that night. A decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life but felt necessary in the moment. He told Robert Johnson that he would never teach guitar again. Not because Robert had surpassed him, though that was true, but because Sun had seen what it cost. Had seen the price Robert paid written in the hollow space behind his eyes. And Sunhouse, who had killed a man and survived prison and played blues that made people weep, was afraid. Afraid that if he taught someone else, they might go looking for the same shortcut Robert had found, might make the same deal, might lose the same piece of themselves. And Sun couldn't live with that weight. Robert Johnson didn't argue, didn't seem surprised, just nodded like he understood completely, like he'd expected nothing less. He stood up, wrapped his guitar, shook Sun's hand. The skin felt cold, too cold for a warm November night. And then Robert walked out into the darkness, leaving Sunhouse alone with his fear and his certainty that he'd just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. Something that broke the rules about how music worked, how learning worked, how the world worked. Sunhouse kept his word. For the next 8 years, until Robert Johnson died in 1938, Sun refused to formally teach anyone to play guitar. He'd jam with people, share a stage, offer advice. But he wouldn't take students, wouldn't pass on technique, wouldn't encourage young players to pursue mastery the way he once had. People asked why. Sun gave different answers to different people. Too busy, too tired, too drunk. But the real reason, the one he only spoke about decades later when Robert Johnson had been dead long enough to become mythology, was simpler and more terrifying. He'd seen what the crossroads produced, had witnessed the cost of supernatural skill, and he wanted no part of creating another Robert Johnson. One was enough, one was too many, one had changed everything. Years later, when musicologists asked Sunhouse about Robert Johnson, he would tell the story carefully. The bad first meeting, the 6-month disappearance, the midnight return, the impossible playing. But he always left out one detail, the thing that haunted him most. Because when Robert had looked at him that night in the juke joint, When their eyes met across 2 guitars and 20 years of age difference, Sun saw something that made him certain the Crossroads story wasn't legend. He saw his own reflection in Robert's pupils. But the reflection was wrong. Upside down. Backwards. Like he was looking at himself from the other side of a mirror that didn't follow normal rules. And in that moment, Sunhouse understood that whatever Robert had traded for his skill, it wasn't just his soul, it was his humanity. The thing that made mistakes human. The thing that made learning necessary. Robert had traded the journey for the destination, and arrived at a place where perfection and damnation were the same thing. Perhaps the crossroads isn't a place. Perhaps it's a choice. The choice to shortcut suffering. To skip the years of practice and failure and slow improvement that make mastery meaningful. Robert Johnson made that choice. Got his skill instantly. Became a legend. And died at 27 with poison in his blood and emptiness in his eyes. Sunhouse made the opposite choice. Learned slowly, failed often, stayed human, and lived to be 86, still playing, still teaching in small ways, still carrying the weight of having witnessed something that proved the old stories were real. In the end, both men got what they wanted. Robert got perfection. Sun got to keep his soul. The question that lingers, the one that makes musicians still talk about that night in that juke joint in that forgotten corner of Mississippi, is simple. Which one made the right choice? And would you have the courage to choose differently if the man in black offered to tune your guitar at midnight where the highways cross?